The first thing that changed was the wind. It had been dry for weeks, whistling through the barn's worn boards, dragging dust and silence down the dirt streets of a forgotten town at the edge of nowhere. But that late afternoon, it blew differently. It no longer spoke of emptiness. It carried warning, the kind of wind that precedes a memory, and it was in that wind that the man arrived. Alone, hat pulled low, driving a wagon that barely carried its own weight. But it wasn't the wagon that was heavy. It was what it bore. In the back, wrapped in faded blankets and tied down with the reverence of a sacred offering, was an upright piano, old, cracked in places, but whole, like something abandoned many times, but never truly broken. The townsfolk watched in silence. He didn't greet anyone, but he didn't avoid them either. He simply passed, like someone who knows he doesn't belong, but came anyway. She saw him from the porch, in the same chair where she'd sat every day since the fire took her boy. 9 years ago. 9 years without a word. Her voice locked behind her eyes, buried with the empty crib, the shuttered windows and unanswered prayers. The neighbors no longer whispered. They simply said she'd become a shadow, that she spoke to the wind, that she smiled at no one, that she lost everything in the fire, even herself. But that afternoon she didn't look away. She watched every step of the horse, every creak of the wheel, and when he climbed down from the wagon in front of the abandoned saloon, pushing open the rusted gate with the piano strapped to his back, something inside her stirred, small, almost imperceptible, like a dry leaf dancing before it falls. And when his fingers first touched the keys, what they heard wasn't what they expected. The sound wasn't pretty, wasn't clean. It was worn, rusted with time, but there was something older than music in it. The piano breathed with him. Every chord cracked open a slit in time, and in that instant, just that one, her hand trembled. A slight gesture, restrained, but real. The teacup on the porch shook gently in its saucer. No one noticed, but she felt it. For the first time in 9 years, she felt something that wasn't pain. It was memory, and memory sometimes is a kind of presence. Inside the saloon, he didn't speak, didn't ask permission, didn't look around. He simply played, as if praying with his hands, as if speaking to the wood. And outside, the wind returned, not just with dust, but with questions, and maybe with answers that didn't need to be said. Because in a place where everything ached in silence, what they heard that day wasn't just music. It was something lost, slowly coming back. The second day he returned to the piano like one visits a grave. No hurry, no fear, but with that quiet respect only those who've lost someone carry. The town kept its distance, peeking through cracks as if watching a ritual they didn't understand, but felt deep in their bones. He sat, adjusted the bench without a sound, inhaled, and played. He didn't ask for attention, didn't need an audience, but played as if the world was listening. The melody wasn't known, not to the living at least. It was a lullaby, soft and curved like a mother's touch, the kind sung slowly to children who still believe sleep is safe. Most didn't recognize it, but she did. The exact note on the third line, the long pause after the fifth. It wasn't a song of the world, it was of her home, from when the crib still stood. Her husband used to hum it when their boy cried at night. It wasn't something taught, it was sacred, and yet he played it. She didn't leave the porch, but her eyes latched onto the sound, not crying, not mouthing the words. But as night fell and the saloon emptied into silence, she stepped down barefoot and crossed to the old door. She didn't enter, just left something on the piano bench. A coin, small, worn, carved with a crooked eagle. The coin her son had in his pocket the day the fire took him, the only thing found whole in the ashes. And now it rested there, as if to say everything without saying a word. From across the empty street, a small boy watched, shirt too big for his frame, hidden behind the hardware store's mailbox. He saw her place the coin, saw her fingers tremble, and for a second, he saw something more. Her lips moved, not with sound, but with shape, as if wanting to sing, just one syllable, one echo. And the boy, the way only children do, understood. He kept that secret like a rare bird that only sings once in a lifetime. That night the wind shifted again, not with force but with tenderness. It carried a song, and a memory no one dared speak aloud, because sometimes what must be heard isn't shouted. It waits in the dark in silence for someone to touch it, without needing to know why. He slept in the church barn, on dry hay under boards that creaked like old bones. The preacher had offered shelter with measured words and wary eyes. "She belongs to the ghosts now," he'd murmured, half warning, half defense. The piano stayed in the saloon, and the man returned to it like one visits an altar, not out of habit, but need. That was where he spoke without words. That was where the dead seemed to listen. One pale morning, he opened the top of the piano to tune a slack string and found something buried deep inside. A photograph, scorched at the edges, its frame still blackened with soot. A man in uniform, sitting stiff as the times demanded, eyes soft despite it. Beside him, a young woman smiling at something outside the frame, the smile full, but surrounded by shadow. The picture looked like it had been rescued in a hurry, ripped from flames too late to save, but just in time to remember. He stared for a long time, then folded the paper gently, as if it weren't paper at all, but skin. That's when he understood. Her silence wasn't mourning, it wasn't weakness. It was a scream refused, a protest, against a town that failed to protect her, against neighbors who whispered more than they welcomed, against the cruelty of being a woman, blamed even for surviving. The fire had taken her child, but it was judgment that burned her home, her eyes, her throat. He kept the photo in his coat like a mission. He knew it wasn't his, but he carried it with the weight of his own wounds. He too had been judged before being known. He too knew the taste of exclusion, not by fire but by rifle. War had marked him a deserter, not because he fled, but because he refused to kill the wrong boy. He paid dearly, with his freedom, his family, a story no one wanted to hear. So he understood. Without words, he understood. And when he played again that afternoon, every note was an apology. Not just his, the town's, the world's. For a woman who did not lose her voice, but chose no longer to give it to those who never truly listened. And in that sound, echoing through dusty walls, hung a question too heavy for speech. How many voices have we buried alive with our silence? Late sunlight filtered through the broken church windows, like fingers of light trying to find what was still alive inside. That was when he played, not for praise but for no one. He played toward the sunset, as if the music were a conversation with time, with memory, with someone who never answered again. And she listened, always from the porch, always still. But that evening, something changed. At the foot of her steps sat a chipped porcelain cup, still warm. No note, no message, just placed there, as if to say, "I see what you're trying to do, and I'm no longer pretending I don't." That was the day his past rode into town. A man in a faded uniform, eyes hard as gravel, arrived with dust on his coat and judgment on his tongue. A marshal, one who doesn't ask questions, only tallies guilt. He stopped at the piano where the man played, not bothering with permission. Silas Morrow, convicted of desertion, claimed by the state. The town, which had only whispered through curtains, now disappeared behind them. Everyone knew truth was about to hurt. Silas didn't rise. He kept playing, hands steady, eyes fixed on the keys, but the silence was tight, ready to snap. And then she stepped down from the porch. For the first time in years, she moved with urgency, bare feet in the dust, body trembling, not with fear but with memory. She walked straight between the two men, between the gun and the music, and stood there. No words, no pleas, just presence. The marshal hesitated, hand still on the weapon, but it was her gaze that stopped him. Not begging, resolute, the dignity of someone who lost everything and still chose to protect what remained human in another, the strength of someone who didn't raise her voice but commanded with her entire being. Because sometimes the boldest act is standing between the bullet and the heart and saying nothing at all. She didn't speak, but in that moment she spoke for him and for herself, and for every time no one had listened. The town fell silent, not out of fear but reverence, because there are gestures that defy explanation. They are remembered, and in that gesture there was more strength than any loaded gun, more truth than any courtroom verdict, more redemption than 1,000 apologies said too late. It rained that night like it hadn't in months, not a wild storm, but a steady, gentle rain, as if the sky itself decided it was time to wash the pain caught in the town's wooden bones. The cracked earth drank it in like hope returning after a long exile, and that grey, damp morning, she stepped outside, barefoot, her dress clinging to her body, hair soaked and clinging to her face. She crossed the street slowly, but with resolve. The wind was cold, but she didn't shiver. She carried something in her chest stronger than time, a decision. She entered the church as one enters sacred ground, not because it was holy, but because it held memory. Silas was already at the piano, back hunched, eyes lowered. He didn't see her come in, but when the air changed, he knew. He played the first note like tracing a scar, the second like asking permission, and then he played that song. Again, but slower this time, more vulnerable. Like trying to remember what he didn't want to forget, or forget what still hurt too much to remember. She didn't speak, but she came closer, sat in the last pew, hands in her lap, eyes closed, and when the melody reached the place where, long ago, her husband used to stop to kiss their son's forehead, she opened her mouth. She didn't speak, but she sang. One note, just one, long, steady, imperfect. A note that wasn't a song, it was a scream held for years, a sob never released. Her forgiveness never asked for, but given anyway. The sound filled the space like light, not to illuminate, but to warm. It wasn't music, it was presence, and for a moment, the world stopped. The marshal, still holding his holster, lowered his hand. His hardened eyes met something that couldn't be bound by rope or law. They met humanity, and the whole town exhaled, as if they had been holding their breath for 9 years, and finally remembered how to breathe. Outside, the rain continued, but inside that church, something had dried. Not the pain, but the silence. And when the final chord faded into the rafters, there were no claps, no words, just the sound of rain tapping the roof, and the silence, now not as absence, but as healing. Because what she released wasn't just a note, it was the part of her buried by grief, and finally, allowed to breathe again. In the days that followed, the town returned to its slow rhythm, but something had changed. Not in the buildings, not in the paths the horses took, not even in the tone of the church bell. It changed in what remained unsaid, in how people looked at one another longer, in how doors didn't shut quite so quickly. It changed in how, for the first time in nearly a decade, she opened the door to the boy's room. The crib was gone, but the scent remained. The dust settled on his toys, the light on the floor where the curtain never moved. She didn't speak, didn't explain. She simply cleaned, gently with damp cloths and steady hands. She didn't cry, but the way she held the broken picture frame told everything. A gesture of care that only exists where love still lives. And even though everything had been taken, she now said with her actions that something would remain. Some part of him would live on in what she chose to care for. Silas never asked to stay, but he began mending the fence, chopped wood, carried water, left sacks of flour leaning against her porch. No notes, no questions, and she never told him to stop. Between them there was a kind of pact, one that required no words. He acted, she allowed, and in that space between doing and permitting, something was born. Not called love, not called friendship, but relief. One day a basket of eggs appeared at the doorstep of his cabin, another time a folded blanket, as if to say, if you're going to keep helping, at least don't be cold. Then one day the house door wasn't locked, not open, but no longer shut. That's how she said what she didn't know how to speak. Even the preacher, once rigid, began nodding when they crossed paths. A short nod, without holiness, but with respect, as if admitting, sometimes it's in silence that God is revealed, and in silence that broken hearts begin to beat again. The town no longer asked for explanations, it simply moved forward. But now there was space between steps, just enough room for someone to breathe, and realize that what once was pain, now was survival, and that surviving, when chosen with gentleness, is also a way to begin again, without speaking, without asking, just living, with dignity, with softness, and with time. On Sundays, he still played, even when no one came, even when the wind was the only visitor through the open church door. The piano, now clean and tuned, was more than an instrument. It was a shrine of memory, a confessional without a priest. He sat there with the same reverence, fingers steady, eyes silent, playing for someone who lived between the shadows of time. Third row, same chair, always empty, but never forgotten. On it, a shawl, folded with precision. Only her hands could manage that. He never moved it, never asked why, he simply played. Nameless melodies, chords that felt like they came from the ground itself. It was his way of speaking to what remained, to what still echoed, even after the end. One afternoon he found something on the piano bench, A yellowed piece of paper folded in four, letters small and handwritten. Her handwriting, gentle, leaning, a little shaky. It was a score, incomplete. It began like the melody he always played, but there were new curves, softer turns, silences between the notes, and at the end, the final line broke off. No final note. He didn't try to finish it, didn't dare. He understood. It was a gift and a goodbye. A whisper of gratitude left gently behind, as if to say, "Now it's yours." He placed the paper inside the piano, then looked down and saw, right there, between the worn pedals, a single white feather, thin, weightless, like those dropped by birds in mid-flight. There were no birds in the church, no open windows, but the feather was there, and he knew she was gone. No funeral, no announcement, just absence, a soft absence, the kind that doesn't hurt, but wraps around you. Her door stayed ajar for days, as if letting the air in one last time, as if waiting for someone to return, but no one did. He never spoke of her, never explained. He just kept playing, because sometimes, when everything that needed to be said was said without words, what remains isn't silence, it's memory, and memory, when held with love, becomes sound, becomes wind, becomes living wood, the echo of a voice that never had to speak to be eternal, the hush of a song that began in mourning and ended in belonging, even without a final note, even with everything left unsaid, because what matters, what truly matters, was never meant to be said, only felt, only left in the world with courage and tenderness, like a feather or a song that doesn't end, it just rests.